And welcome to another edition of South Texas Crossfire. This is Attorney Joe Flores reminding you to join us each and every week right here on KTMB with the Lopez family. Special thanks to Don Humberto Lozano Lopez. He passed away in 2011, but he's honored, he's venerated, and he's never forgotten. And also our sponsors, River City Hospice, 882-5900. We're having an exciting show coming on, a documentary on hospice, and they're sponsoring it. Call hospice today. It's not what you think it is. River City Hospice, 882-5900, or check up with them on rivercityhospice.com. And also Vasquez Flores Home Health, 881-9922, backed by over 25 years of nursing experience. Priscilla Vasquez can help get you an exciting career today. Also, we want to thank a new sponsor coming on down the pike, and that's Physician Express and X-Ray on Wheels. Look them up on the internet or call them, Physician Express and X-Ray on Wheels. With me today, we're going to be going to an interesting interview that I had with Terry Nelson, retired 3 decades. He worked in conjunction with many law enforcement divisions like DEA around the world, and he's saying that we are losing the war on drugs, not winning. We are losing the war on drugs. We went to him and talked to him and his organization, LEAP, and he talked about many law enforcement officials who agree the same thing. We are throwing down money down a hole that is just going to be wasted on privatization of prisons, on long mandatory sentences in the federal system, and we're housing 5 times as many people per capita than anybody else in the world. We have 5% of the population, yet we have 25% of the entire prison population. We house twice as many people as and twice as long of the sentences as those in France, Europe, and other westernized countries. So we're going to go to him, we're going to talk to him about this and find out his take on why we are losing, and I underline that, losing the war on drugs. And we're going to get this retired federal and also aviation supervisor's take on it. Good morning. And should Supervisor Nelson or Terry okay?
Terry's fine, Joe. I'm no longer carrying the badge.
Well, I want to thank you for your years of serving, and it's a great honor to have you on here because I am going to come out here and my views don't reflect those of the station or the radio that are radio listeners or television listeners, but I'm going to say this war on drugs is problematic. True or not true?
Oh, it's absolutely the truth that the prohibition of drugs causes the crime, not the drugs themselves. It's the prohibition that causes all the crime and violence and the death and misery in the Western Hemisphere and other parts of the world.
I mean, I just have to be honest with you here, Terry. Officer Nelson. The thing is that you're like McLeod. I mean, you are lawenforcement.com. When we look at you, I mean, you look like a lawman, and it's almost an oxymoron that you're saying, on the one hand, I'm a lawman, I've been fighting the war on drugs forever, but then on the other you say, we're losing $1 trillion down the drain. Just like the wars in Afghanistan and the wars in Iraq that we've fought so hard for, a lot of it has been fruitless. And so are you saying here on television that we are losing the war on drugs?
Well, I completely agree with it. We've had 40 years of a major failed public policy, and to continue doing the same thing and expecting different results would be insane. So we definitely need to change our strategy on how we deal with our drug issues in America. And we at LEAP, which stands for Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, we have membership in over 80 countries in the world and 160-some-odd thousand supporters. So we at LEAP believe that the best thing to do is to legalize the drugs and put them under a strict system of regulation and control so we can, control who gets them and at what age, etc. And we can also control the dosage so you know how strong the product is. Right now, you don't have a clue. And we have to couple this with a very strong education program, credible education, no more lying to the kids, credible education, and we believe we can get control of our drugs because countries that have done it have had great success in reducing drug use into targeted age groups.
And I'm going to get into those specific examples, but something here, you are our first lawman who's come out on record here at South Texas Crossfire on KTMB, our stations down here that reach a couple of hundred Latinos and a lot of more people on the internet. But you were saying that that we need a major policy change. And by doing that, that there's an obvious lack of progress towards winning the war on drugs. I mean, you've been on there on the front lines. You've been on the operations here, Central America, Mexico. What do you mean by that, that we need a different sort of decriminalization? You told us about the dosage and everything, but, you know, people are up in arms. The right-wingers are going to be saying, are you kidding me? I mean, then we're just throwing away all the money that we've invested over 4 decades.
Well, we've already thrown it away, so that's a moot point. But we don't have to throw another big $1.2 trillion away in the next 20, 30 years fighting a failed policy. If something doesn't work, you don't continue down that path. You try a different strategy. And what we're promoting is a different strategy, a different way of dealing with our drug problems. Now, in countries that have tried it, now they haven't done total legalization. They've done decriminalization in Portugal. And the drug use by 13 to 19-year-olds, which is a targeted group of teenagers, is down by 22 to 25%. And heroin overdose deaths have dropped by 52%. So that kind of success is laudable, and we need to try something different, because all we're doing in America is filling our jails up and destroying kids' lives and destroying their ability to be strong contributing members of society but making enough money to pay decent taxes. If you've got an arrest record, a felony record sitting on your record, you're going to have a tough time getting a good job. You can't even get a college loan. You can't get licensed in some states. Some states you lose the right to vote. It has to stop, because it's really destroying the youth of our nation.
Well, to those that say that Terry Nelson, that was a GS-14 group supervisor, you're a veteran of the U.S. Coast Guard and specialist in Vietnam, Thailand, Philippines, 9 years in the Border Patrol, also an instructor, DFW, everything you've seized by, with interdisciplinary people in there, 230,000 pounds or more cocaine. You're saying the war on drugs is failing? Aren't we getting good arrests? Aren't we stopping those pushers?
Oh, yeah, we're stopping the one we arrest, but he's immediately replaced by someone else. When you make an arrest in the drug war, all you do is create a job vacancy for the next guy waiting in line that's willing to risk death or life in prison for the amount of money that can be made peddling drugs.
So what we're doing here is give us some positive, concrete examples of policy changes. How you would control or regulate or legalize drugs? How would we be able to harness this Leviathan? I mean, if we're going to try to legalize drugs, what kind of plan could there be? What kind of sort of actions could be in place that could balance the legalization of drugs with law enforcement policies?
In the last 10 years, we've created 14 million new drug felons in the United States of America. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to know that if you've got 14 million people that could be contributing more to income tax and sales tax and being actual, contributing members of society, cannot do it because they're now marginalized in the amount of money that they can make, where they can work, et cetera. And we're really just shooting ourselves in the foot, because if it were working, I might be able to buy in on it a little more, but it's not working, and you can't show me, no one can argue with me and tell me that the war on drugs is a success. It's failed in every way, manner, shape, and form, and as a matter of fact, the Government Accounting Office just came out with and scathingly beat up the drug czar for asking for another $27 billion to continue a program that does not meet any of its goals. The words they said were, the Government Accounting Office said that the ONDCP and the federal government have not made progress towards achieving most of the goals articulated to the 2010 National Drug Control Strategy. In some cases, they've even lost ground. So this is a policy that just isn't working, and we should not be continuing policies that don't work, especially policies that cause great harm to our citizenry.
So, group supervisor, let's get this straight, seized over a quarter of a million pounds of cocaine. You were part of that. Lawman, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, doing the Golden Triangle, South America, Central America, trying to stop drugs. And you are saying that this war is unwinnable.
Well, we'll just take Shorty Guzman, El Chapo, for an example. El Chapo probably has somewhere a little bit south of 40,000 people on his payroll. And you throw in the other three major cartels, they probably have the amount of people on their payroll that almost equals the size of the Mexican army. And you can trust me on this one. Mexico does not want to go to war, all-out war with the cartels, because there's a good possibility they would not win it, because they're going to be outmatched when it comes down to the sheer numbers. So we're creating a monster here that the profits are so high on these drugs. They're not worth hardly anything just in their native state. It's a prohibition of them make them worth a lot of money. And then these gangsters are just getting rich, and then they get powerful enough to where they're no longer subject to the laws of their land or any other law for that matter. And the only way to stop them is to cut their heads off with the financial way of doing it. I don't mean that in a literal sense, but cut off the money chain coming in to where they don't have as much power to corrupt government officials, police, etc. If you don't have hundreds of millions of dollars to play in bribes that you can throw away, you're not going to be able to control the police and the local legislatures and the judges and stuff when you go to court. And not to mention just Mexico, all along our southern border, our own police forces are corrupted to the ninth degree all along the border. It just corrupts, drugs corrupt everything they touch, and we need to have a different strategy in dealing with it. That's my take.
Truth be told, on the politics and the chest beating and the backslapping, we're looking at a multi-billion-dollar industry known as the privatization of prisons. The marriage, the incestual marriage that I say between the prison system, the federal system, where we have privatization. Where is all the rehabilitation? They don't want to let people out because they're making money by keeping these people housed, and the taxpayer, little do they know, and especially in the federal system, is $28,000 and counting right now for a healthy prisoner. How do you respond to that and the privatization of prisons?
I'll give you my take on that. It's all about the money, of course. When you're a police investigator, you follow the money, you find the crime. Government agencies in America, I just mentioned the ONDCP asked for $27 billion to continue this failed war. Private prisons, the fastest growing industry in America, billions of dollars go to prison. Private prisons where we're housing our citizens to make profit for a private company. The treatment industry, there's 200,000 people a year going to drug treatment. 37% of them are mandated by the courts. Now, you take a casual cannabis user, you arrest him for using it or packing a little bit on him, you send him to a treatment industry to treat his addiction. I'm sorry, he's not addicted, he's a user. There's a big difference between abuse and use. Now, the testing industry, that's a $5 billion a year business right there to drug test these kids in high school and sports programs, and everybody that gets hired has to be drug tested. Pharmaceutical companies, they don't want to compete against medical cannabis or any kind of legal cannabis because people would rather smoke than take pills to go to sleep. Alcoholic beverages, they don't want to compete either because they'd lose. Banks making billions of dollars off the processing drug money, military suppliers and contractors, they get about $2 billion a year. If drug trafficking represents 8% of the world's trade and is untaxed and unregulated, it must stop.
Well, and that pretty much sums up, what a lot of people suspect is that the private prisons are housing a lot of our citizens on drug sentences that are way extended. Some of these quote-unquote drug pushers and possessors that are bringing in 500 pounds, 1,000 pounds of marijuana, 2,000, 3,000 pounds. They're looking at mandatory minimums of 10 years in prison, and the taxpayer forgets he's got to pay at least, if they're healthy, $25,000 a year. What's your take on these private prisons and how many people that are quote-unquote, casualties on the war on drugs that are being housed in there? What is their motivation other than profit? I mean, as far as politically and spreading, aren't they giving people in small towns jobs just like Walmart?
Sure they are. At the expense of our own citizens, though. Two of the previous drug czars are actually sit on the boards and own stock in prison industries. I won't give their names and I won't give the industry, but you can look them up on the internet. Two of our previous drug czars sit and own stock in private prison industries. Now, what does that tell you? It's all about the money. It's not about the lives that are being destroyed. And I was in Las Vegas a few years back at the Latino Police Officers annual meeting. I had a conversation with a bright young Latino officer, and he was talking about private prisons. And I looked him dead in the eye and said, you ought to be ashamed of yourself to use your badge to put someone in prison that someone else can profit off of. That just, to me, that crosses the line. If we're going to put people in prison, if the federal government or the state government is going to do it, then they need to build the prisons and face the financial cost of doing it. Because these private prisons are not run as well. They claim they are. They're run cheaper. That's true. But cheap is not the answer here. That makes it easier to keep doing it. Now, to Texas's credit, we've closed 3 prisons. Well, 2. We'll close 2 this coming month. That'll be 3 prisons that's been closed in Texas in the last 3 years. I'm going to give a Right on Crime a pat on the back for that. Someone is looking at it, and Jerry Madden is one of the men that's really been a driver behind this. So if people do good things, you got to compliment them. So I'll compliment them on that. They're trying to get a hold of it, but there's a better way to do it, and the best way to do it is just completely legalize this. Stop housing people for minor offenses that are crimes against no one but themselves. I'm a registered Republican, and I'll quote President Reagan. President Reagan said, "Government exists to protect us from each other. It fails when it tries to protect us from ourselves. And if the government's going to protect you from what you can put into your body and you're causing no harm to anyone else, then it has way overstepped its bounds."
Now, after 3 decades of law enforcement, and, you know, the right-wingers are going to say out there, even I'm going to say, now, wait a minute, I don't feel comfortable legalizing heroin, methamphetamine, all these things that are destroying our children. Marijuana is one thing, but how do you respond to those people that say meth, heroin, cocaine, no way?
Well, first and foremost, methamphetamine would not even exist if it hadn't been for Prohibition. Before Prohibition, there was a little thing called amphetamine 20s or Black Beaters or LA Crosses, which were high speed that college kids took in school to study for examinations and stuff. You felt so down bad afterwards you didn't want any more of it. The methamphetamine is dangerous. It's a terrible drug, but once again, it exists only because of Prohibition. Now, as far as cocaine, all right, there's about around 2 million pounds of blow comes out of the Andean Ridge nations in South America, the Andean Ridge area of South America, a year. 2 million pounds. That's 3 grams for every man, woman, and child in America. And even if we manage to spray all the crops in Colombia, which we haven't done because they've tripled the yield of the cocoa plants in Colombia, by the way. But even it will grow in equatorial Africa just as it will grow in Colombia and Peru and Ecuador and Bolivia. So all they'll do is move to Africa because the money is so much, there's so much money out of the illegality of these trades. And the public just has to go back and listen. And I say to people when I speak to Rotary clubs, I say, if this is a dish of heroin and this is a dish of cocaine and these pills here are methamphetamine, how many of you would come up and use it? And no one raises their hand. So I say to them, so you're the only smart people in America in this room? People aren't going to use these drugs if you give them credible education and tell them what it's going to do to them. And those that are stupid enough to continue and do it, well, you know, you're doing this to yourself. And it's a very bad choice, but you're doing it to yourself. So heroin, we occupy the country of Afghanistan right now and have for the last 11 years. And 60-some-odd% increase in heroin production in Afghanistan, a country we occupy. When we leave Afghanistan, they're saying that the Afghans will use heroin and opium paste for money. So we're not winning. So why keep doing something that doesn't work? We need to change the strategy. Now, we at LEAP don't condone or encourage the use of any drug. I mean, we want that to be clear. But we think the drugs will do less harm than a prison sentence because you can get over the addiction, but you will never beat a conviction.
Okay. You know, and the devastation of that conviction, I mean, it affects a family. It affects a person getting government aid. It affects a person going to school. Again, what would be your solution other than having these people? I mean, obviously, now drugs aren't legal around the world, but what programs have worked? And I promised we'd get back to that. Give me Portugal's
example.
Drug policy or anybody's drug policy.
In Switzerland, they started giving heroin addicts. They offered them a clinic to shoot up in, and it was about $5 or $6 a shot. And this was a 12-year program where they studied it. At the end of this 12 years, well, it's still ongoing, by the way, but after 12 years, not one person in the program has died of a heroin overdose since it was implemented. And they have lower rates of crime, death, and disease, a drop in expected new users, improvement in mental and physical health, and their felony crime dropped by 60%. That's with heroin in Switzerland. Now, in Portugal, Heroin, as I mentioned earlier, heroin overdose deaths are down by 52%, and HIV infections reported by drug users down by 71% because they're no longer sharing needles and stuff. This is success. The HIV and hepatitis C is primarily spread by using contaminated needles, by addicts and stuff using them. That alone, down by an amazing 71% in HIV infections. These programs work. And, of course, Portugal had the same discussion we're having. Well, why, God, if you do this, the sky's going to fall. They did it, and the sky didn't fall. Colorado and Washington State have now legalized cannabis. And I haven't seen the sky fall yet. Of course, there's another few months left in this year. It's possible it'll fall by December. But it's not going to. Tax revenues are going to go up. They're going to make money off of it, and they're not going to be wasting money putting people in jail for doing something to themselves.